Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snow had already started falling when my friend Jake and I arrived at the campsite. We had been planning the winter camping trip for months, eager to spend a weekend away from the city and enjoy the crisp, fresh air of the mountain woods. Neither of us had ever camped in the dead of winter before, but we'd done our share of roughing it in the summer months. The cold, we figured, would only add to the adventure. The campsite was in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains, about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. We had hiked for hours to reach it, the snow thickening as we climbed higher. By the time we set up our tent and got the fire going, it was already late afternoon, and the sun had disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds. The world around us had become a gray, snow-covered expanse of trees and rock. The only sounds the wind whistling through the branches and the occasional crackle of our fire. As the night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. We huddled near the fire, trying to stay warm while cooking a simple meal of freeze-dried food. The wind howled outside and the cold seeped in through the seams of our tent. It was the kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath freeze in the air. Jake and I sat in silence, staring into the fire. We both had the same feeling, an odd sense of unease that we couldn't shake. It wasn't anything obvious, just a lingering sense that something was wrong. We had been in the woods many times before, but tonight felt different. "I don't like this," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant. I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's just," he said, glancing around the campsite as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I tried to brush it off. "It's just the weather. It's been a long day, man, and the cold's getting to us. We'll feel better once we're in the sleeping bags." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The woods around us felt different, still, too still. No sounds from wildlife, no movement in the trees, just the wind and the occasional crunch of snow underfoot. We finished eating in silence, and soon enough the darkness seemed to grow even deeper around us. It wasn't long before we crawled into the tent to get some rest. We both had sleeping bags rated for freezing temperatures, but the cold still crept into the corners of the tent, making it hard to fall asleep. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind outside. But then, as I started to drift off, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint sound. Footsteps crunching in the snow. They were slow and deliberate, like someone walking around our campsite. At first, I thought it was Jake, maybe getting up to use the bathroom or check the fire. But then I realized Jake was still lying next to me, breathing steadily in his sleep. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. The footsteps were getting closer, too close, and they didn't sound like someone just walking. They sounded like they were circling the tent, methodically, as if they were trying to make sure we didn't hear them. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the dark. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then came the softest sound, a scraping noise against the side of the tent. I froze, my mind racing. Who could be out there in the middle of nowhere in this weather? The nearest person was miles away. I nudged Jake awake. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling, "do you hear that?" He stirred, groggy but alert. "Hear what?" "The footsteps," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's out there." Jake sat up slowly, his eyes wide with confusion. "You're kidding, right?" "No, I'm serious. There's someone outside." He listened for a moment, but the sounds had stopped. The only noise now was the wind howling through the trees. "It's probably just an animal," Jake said, sounding more annoyed than scared. "You're hearing things." But I wasn't convinced. There was something in the air, a palpable sense of dread that I couldn't ignore. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting, or maybe I was imagining things after a long day of hiking. But then, it happened again. A faint scraping sound followed by a sharp tap on the tent. I shot upright, my breath catching in my throat. It was real, and it was happening again. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was closer now, right up against the tent. I shook Jake awake more forcefully this time. "Jake, get up! Someone's out there!" He was fully awake now, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? Are you sure?" I nodded, my chest tightening. "Yes, I swear, I heard it." We lay there in silence, listening. The tapping stopped, but the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, circling the tent once more. "Should we go out there?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No, we stay in the tent," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "We don't know who or what it is. It could be dangerous." We both lay there in the darkness, too terrified to move, our minds racing with the possibilities. Was it a person? A hunter? Some kind of animal? But no animal would walk in that deliberate pattern, and no human would be out here in this storm unless they were lost. The footsteps seemed to come and go, circling the tent in silence for what felt like hours. The cold had seeped into our bones, and every little noise made us jump. Then, just when we thought we might be imagining the whole thing, the tent suddenly shifted. I felt a weight press against the side of it, as if someone was standing right outside, leaning against the fabric. Jake and I both held our breath, wide-eyed, too afraid to make a sound. The weight on the tent stayed there for what felt like an eternity. And then, with one last eerie scraping sound, it was gone. The footsteps disappeared into the night. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither of us spoke, but we both lay there, listening for any further sounds, trying to convince ourselves that we were just hearing things. But in the deepest part of my mind, I knew that something had been out there. Something we couldn't explain. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, and the sun was struggling to break through the clouds. The world outside looked peaceful, the trees dusted with fresh snow, the air crisp and clear, but the feeling of dread still hung over us like a cloud. We packed up our camp quickly, barely saying a word to each other. I don't think either of us wanted to be there anymore. We hiked back down the trail in silence, our eyes scanning the woods, half expecting to see someone or something following us. We never spoke about that night again. It was as if the memory of it was too much to bear, a story we couldn't bring ourselves to tell anyone else. But I know what I heard, and I know what we both felt. Somewhere in those woods, there's a presence that never left, and it's still out there. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was the middle of winter when I decided to go camping with my friend Mike. We'd been planning this trip for months, talking about it endlessly. Mike was always the adventurous one, and I was content to follow along, happy to escape the grind of daily life for a few days in the wilderness. We chose a remote site deep in the forest, far away from the usual camping areas. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. The forecast predicted a heavy snowstorm, but that didn't deter us. The woods were peaceful and quiet, and I found comfort in the thought of being surrounded by nothing but the sound of our own breaths and the crackle of the campfire. We packed our gear and set off in high spirits, the snow crunching underfoot as we trekked deeper into the forest. By the time we reached the site, it was already beginning to snow heavily, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The world felt muffled, distant, as if the snow had created a barrier between us and the rest of reality. We set up our tent quickly, the cold biting at our skin as we worked. The wind howled through the trees, making the whole forest creak and groan. It felt as if the trees were alive, watching us. But I pushed the thought away, trying to focus on the task at hand. Once the tent was set up, we built a fire. The flames flickered and danced in the snow's pale light, casting long shadows around us. We sat close to the fire, the warmth a welcome contrast to the freezing air. As the night wore on, we cooked our food and shared stories, laughing about the silly things we'd done in the past. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something strange. The wind, which had been roaring outside, suddenly seemed to die down. It wasn't a gradual fading, but an abrupt silence. The only sound left was the crackling of the fire. It felt unnaturally quiet. And then I heard something else, something distant but distinct. A voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The voice sounded like it was calling from the edge of the woods, barely above a whisper, as if it were carried on the wind. At first, I thought it might have been the sound of someone else camping nearby, but we were far from any marked trails. Mike had heard it too. I could see it in his eyes as he looked toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mike nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, it's coming from over there." He pointed into the blackness beyond the ring of light from the fire. I wanted to brush it off as the wind playing tricks on us, but there was something unnerving about the voice. It didn't sound natural. It wasn't human. It was just a whisper, but it had an eerie quality to it, like it was beckoning us. We decided to investigate, though part of me wanted to stay by the fire. We both grabbed flashlights, but when we stepped away from the warmth of the flames, the temperature seemed to drop even further, an unnatural cold that seeped into our bones. We moved slowly, our breath fogging in the air. The forest was eerily quiet again, save for that voice. It was still there, faint, but growing louder as we ventured further into the woods. The snow crunched under our boots, but the voice continued to rise in intensity. It was as if it were guiding us, urging us forward. My heart started to race as I realized how far we'd gone from the campfire. The darkness was suffocating now, and the trees around us seemed to close in. We were no longer just in the woods, we were in something else, something otherworldly. The whispers began to sound clearer, more desperate. "Help me," it called, the voice a mournful wail. It was unmistakably human now, but there was something wrong about it. The words felt twisted, like they were being dragged out of the speaker with great effort. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Mike, we need to turn back." Mike didn't respond. He was staring into the darkness, a look of fascination on his face. It was as if the voice had entranced him. I think it's coming from over there," he said, his voice distant. He began to walk deeper into the woods, away from me. "Mike, wait!" I shouted, but my voice felt small and weak in the face of whatever was out there. I followed him, fear clawing at my chest. We reached a small clearing, and in the center of it, there was something strange. A tree, its bark blackened as if burned, stood tall in the middle of the snow. Around its base, the ground was cracked open about as if something had tried to escape from beneath. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around us, and I could feel a strange pressure in my chest. I couldn't breathe right, like the air itself was being squeezed out of me. Suddenly, Mike dropped to his knees in front of the tree, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you see it?" he gasped, his voice trembling. I turned to follow his gaze, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the tree and the darkness surrounding it. The voice was still echoing in my ears, and I felt a cold hand grasping at my heart. Without thinking, I grabbed Mike by the shoulders and yanked him back, pulling him away from the tree. His body was cold and stiff, and his face had taken on a pale, unnatural color. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. As I tried to drag him back to the camp, I felt something in the air, a pressure that seemed to grow heavier the further we moved away from the tree. The whispers became louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself were alive and trying to pull us back. We stumbled through the snow, the darkness closing in around us. I could barely see the path we had taken. The trees seemed to shift, moving as if they were watching us. The cold was unbearable now, biting at our skin. Every step felt like we were being pulled backward, as if the forest itself was unwilling to let us leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the glow of the campfire through the trees. I didn't stop to look back, but I felt something following us. The whispers had grown into a chorus, a cacophony of voices that filled the air, all calling out to us, urging us to return. But we didn't stop. We pushed through the snow, back to the warmth of the fire. When we finally made it back to the tent, I slammed the flap shut behind us. Mike collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His face was twisted with fear, his eyes wide and unseeing. I tried to calm him, but he didn't respond. It was as if he had seen something in the woods, something that had broken him. The fire flickered outside, but the whispers didn't stop. They were there, just beyond the tent, faint and desperate. They followed us back to the camp. I could hear them, always just out of reach, calling for help. And that was when I realized the truth. The forest had never let us leave. It had always been waiting for us to come back. The whispers were not from the wind or the trees. They were the voices of those who had wandered into the woods before us and never returned. And now, we were part of them. I sat in the dark, the cold creeping into my bones, unable to sleep. The whispers continued, calling to us, urging us to follow them back into the woods. And I knew that one day we would. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We had been planning the winter camping trip for months. My friend Alex and I had always loved the outdoors. And this winter, we decided to take it up a notch by camping in the Adirondack Mountains. It would be just the two of us, alone in the wilderness, surrounded by thick forests and untouched snow. The plan was simple: hike to a secluded campsite, set up our tent, start a fire, and enjoy the peace and quiet of the winter landscape. It was late December when we arrived at the trailhead. The air was crisp and a light snow was falling, dusting the world in a fresh blanket of white. We had the trail to ourselves, and the only sound we could hear was the crunch of our boots in the snow. We hiked for hours, the trees towering over us, their branches heavy with snow, creating a cathedral of white all around us. It was beautiful and serene, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling deep in my gut, an unease I couldn't quite explain. Alex, as usual, was in good spirits. He was the more experienced camper between us and didn't seem fazed by the isolation or the harsh weather. As we walked, we talked about everything from school to our favorite hiking spots, but I noticed his conversation grew quieter the farther we went. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in on us, and the path became harder to follow, almost like it was deliberately closing in around us. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped significantly. We set up our tent and got a fire going, both of us grateful for the warmth. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but the fire kept us comfortable as we huddled close. We had planned to stay up late enjoying the fire, but the silence of the forest pressed in on us. The sound of the wind was constant, and the crackling of the fire was the only other noise, but every now and then I thought I heard something in the distance, almost like footsteps crunching in the snow. At first, I dismissed it. It was probably just the wind or an animal moving through the woods, but the sound kept coming back, growing closer each time. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but a creeping feeling of dread settled in my chest. Something didn't feel right. I looked at Alex, who was poking at the fire with a stick, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Alex looked up. "What?" "The footsteps," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It sounds like someone's walking out there." Alex's brow furrowed. "Probably just a deer or something. It's winter, man. Animals are out here even in the cold." I wasn't convinced. It was more than just the sound of animals moving through the snow. It sounded deliberate, like someone was pacing in the distance. I turned my head, scanning the edge of the camp, where the dark trees stood like silent sentinels. "You sure?" I pressed, my unease growing. Alex shrugged. "I don't hear anything now, but I guess if it makes you feel better, we can check it out." We both stood up, grabbing our flashlights. Alex made his way toward the edge of the campsite, his boots crunching in the snow, while I stayed by the fire, holding my breath. The light from our flashlights flickered in the darkness as we swept it across the trees. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone out there. "It's probably just an animal," Alex said, shaking his head. "Come on, let's get back to the fire." I wanted to agree with him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We went back to the fire and sat down, but the footsteps continued in my mind, echoing in my thoughts. The night stretched on, and we eventually retired to the tent. The wind howled outside, but the fire had died down, leaving only the faintest glow. As I lay there trying to fall asleep, I kept hearing the sound again. This time, it was closer. A slow, deliberate crunching of snow, like someone was walking just outside the tent. My heart began to race, and I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the sound was too real, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps continued, and now they were joined by something else. A soft tapping sound, as if someone were gently rapping on the side of the tent. My stomach twisted with fear. "Alex," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Alex, wake up!" He stirred, groggily rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "There's something outside," I said, my voice trembling. "I hear footsteps and tapping." Alex sat up, his face pale. "What? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Listen." We both lay there in silence, listening to the wind outside, but there it was again, the tapping, soft and rhythmic, as if someone was standing right outside the tent, knocking gently on the fabric. The footsteps had stopped, but the tapping grew louder, as though whatever it was had moved closer. Alex looked at me, his face full of concern. "We need to check it out," he said, reaching for the flashlight. Stay close. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Alex unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the campsite. The beam swept across the snow, casting long shadows on the trees, but there was no one in sight. No tracks, no signs of movement, just the quiet, endless white of the snow-covered ground. Nothing, Alex said, his voice shaky. I don't see anything. We both stood there for a long moment, listening. The wind was still howling through the trees, but there were no footsteps, no tapping. The air was cold, biting, and everything around us seemed unnervingly still. I think it's just the wind, Alex said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Let's get back in the tent. We hurried back inside the tent and zipped it up tightly. I lay there, my heart racing, the cold creeping into my bones. The air felt heavier now, as if something was pressing down on the tent. The silence outside seemed unnatural, as if the world had gone completely still. Just as I was beginning to settle down again, the sound came once more, soft, steady, tapping. But this time it wasn't just on the tent. It was on the tree branches above us, the snow crunching underfoot as something moved through the trees, close to the camp. I held my breath, my eyes wide, straining to hear. I can't take this anymore, Alex whispered. We need to leave, now. He was right. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't something we could explain. Fear settled over us like a thick fog, and I could feel the presence of something just beyond our vision, something that didn't belong. We gathered our things quickly, not even bothering to pack up the camp properly. We didn't care about anything except getting out of there. We left the campsite in a hurry, hiking back through the snow in the dark, the eerie tapping continuing to echo in the distance, but we didn't look back. The further we got from the site, the more the sound seemed to fade, as though whatever it was had finally stopped following us. We didn't stop walking until we reached the trailhead, hours later, exhausted and terrified. Neither of us spoke much on the way back, but the feeling of being watched never left us. We never went back to that campsite, and to this day I don't know what we encountered out there. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person. Whatever it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been there, something that didn't belong in that silent, snow-covered forest. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be the perfect escape. A weekend in the woods, just me and my friend Ben, away from the noise and stress of city life. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, discussing all the gear we'd need, the route we'd take, and how we'd build the perfect campfire. We'd done it before in the summer, but this time it was winter, a decision I would soon regret. Ben and I had been friends for years, bonded by a shared love for the outdoors. We'd camped in all sorts of places, from well-maintained sites to remote, off-the-beaten-path spots. This time, though, we decided to venture deep into the woods of the Appalachian Mountains, far from any trailheads or marked campsites. The weather was frigid and the forecast predicted snow, but we were seasoned campers. A little cold and snow wouldn't stop us. The hike to our chosen site took longer than we expected. The snow had begun to fall as we started our ascent, and soon the ground beneath our boots was slick with ice. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun was already setting, casting long, eerie shadows over the trees. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, and the world around us was becoming a blur of white. We quickly set up our tent and fire pit, working together in silence. The cold was biting, but the warmth of the fire would keep us comfortable, at least for the time being. As we settled into our sleeping bags inside the tent, the crackle of the fire was the only sound that filled the otherwise still night. For the first few hours, things were peaceful. We joked and laughed, passing around a flask of whiskey to keep the chill at bay. The firelight flickered through the thin walls of the tent, casting shadows on the snow outside. It was the kind of night where you could forget everything else, where the world felt far away and nothing mattered except the warmth of the fire and the company of a good friend. But then, at around midnight, it happened. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The wind had stopped. In the winter, the wind is constant, whistling through the trees, pushing snowflakes around. But now there was nothing, not a sound. The fire crackled faintly, but that was it. It felt like the entire forest had fallen into a deep, unnatural quiet. Ben, who had been lounging by the fire, stood up abruptly, his eyes scanning the dark forest around us. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I turned my head, trying to listen, but all I could hear was the faint crackling of the fire and the thumping of my own heartbeat in my ears. I shook my head, feeling uneasy. "Hear what?" I asked, though I was beginning to feel it too. Something was wrong. Ben didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing and peered into the darkness beyond the firelight. I watched him, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. He stood there for a few moments, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back to the fire, his face pale. "We're not alone," he said quietly. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" Ben didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring into the darkness. His eyes were wide, his face etched with worry. "I saw something," he said finally. "I'm not sure what it was, but there's someone or something out there." I laughed nervously, trying to brush off his words. "You're just imagining things. It's the cold, man. You're seeing things." But Ben shook his head. "I'm not imagining things. I saw it clearly. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees. I swear to God." I looked into the darkness, but all I could see were the trees, the snow-covered ground, and the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. There was nothing else, just the eerie stillness. "You're just freaked out," I said, trying to calm both of us. "We've been out here all night. It's just your mind playing tricks." Ben didn't look convinced, but he sat back down next to the fire. We both tried to ignore the tension hanging in the air, but it was impossible. My mind kept wandering back to the figure Ben had seen, and soon I found myself scanning the darkness too, half expecting to see something move. The hours passed slowly. We both tried to go to sleep, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was unbearable, and every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, just out of reach in the woods beyond our campsite. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, straining to hear. Ben was already awake. He had his head poking out of the tent, his eyes wide with fear. "You hear that?" he whispered urgently. I nodded, my mouth dry. The footsteps were growing louder now, coming closer to our campsite. I could hear them clearly. Someone, or something, was walking just outside the firelight. "Who's out there?" I called into the darkness, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. A few seconds passed in complete silence. Then I heard something else, a low, guttural voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help." The word was drawn out, almost a whisper, but it was clear. It came from the direction of the footsteps, somewhere in the dark woods. My blood ran cold, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ben, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, that wasn't human." We were both frozen in place, unable to move. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the trees. The wind began to pick up again, but the air still felt thick with something we couldn't see. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, though distorted, strained as if the words were coming from a great distance. It sounded like someone in pain, desperate for help. Without thinking, I grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him toward the tent. "We have to go. Now." But Ben was frozen, his eyes wide as he stared into the darkness. "Wait," he whispered. "What if someone's out there? What if we can help?" "No," I said, pulling him with more force. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't wait for him to respond. I zipped up the tent, grabbed our gear, and began to scramble to break down the camp. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I tried to keep my bearings. Ben was still hesitant, but I dragged him along, too terrified to stay another moment. Just as we finished packing, we heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, right at the edge of the clearing. We didn't wait any longer. We bolted through the snow, not caring which direction we were running in. We just had to get away. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead, hours later, that we finally stopped to catch our breath. We were both shaking, our eyes darting over our shoulders, expecting to see someone, or something, still following us. But there was nothing. The forest was silent once more. The next morning, we contacted the local authorities, reporting what had happened. They sent a team to search the area, but they found no trace of anyone else in the woods, no footprints or signs of anyone having been out there. The only tracks in the snow were our own. No one ever explained what we heard that night, but neither Ben nor I ever spoke of it again, and we never went camping in those woods again. Some places are best left undisturbed. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. My best friend Emma and I had been talking about camping in the winter for months, and we were excited to finally make it happen. The plan was simple. Drive up to a remote campsite in the mountains, pitch a tent, enjoy the solitude, and hike in the snow. Neither of us had ever camped in the winter before, but we both liked the idea of a challenge. Plus, we were both experienced campers, so we figured we could handle it. We arrived at the campsite on a Saturday afternoon. The weather was cold but not unbearable, with snow already covering the ground. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches drooping under the weight of it. The air had a sharp, crisp quality to it, and we could see our breath as we spoke. It felt like we were the only ones in the world, just the two of us, surrounded by endless white deep in the wilderness. The first few hours went by without incident. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and got the campfire going. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped rapidly, and we huddled near the fire, wrapping ourselves in layers of clothes and blankets. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. "We've got the whole place to ourselves," Emma said, her voice warm despite the cold. "It's perfect." I agreed, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. The forest around us was completely still. No wind, no animals, nothing. It was an odd kind of silence, the kind that makes you aware of every sound, no matter how small. At times I thought I could hear something, distant footsteps crunching in the snow, but when I listened closer it was gone. "You okay?" Emma asked, noticing my sudden quiet. "Yeah, just a little weirded out," I admitted, shrugging. "It's so quiet, you know? Like too quiet." Emma laughed it off. "You're just not used to the peace and quiet of the woods in winter. It's different, but it's nice. It'll grow on you." I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. The kind of anxiety that you can't quite explain, that crawls under your skin and makes you jumpy. I pushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves and the unfamiliar setting. We sat by the fire for a few more hours, and eventually we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled the zipper tight, hoping the warmth would lull me to sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint light on the tent, but the wind had started up again, howling through the trees. It made the fabric of the tent flap in the breeze, and I found it hard to relax with the constant noise. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind. I kept telling myself to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I would hear a noise, something scraping against the side of the tent, soft but deliberate. I convinced myself it was just the wind or a branch rubbing against the fabric, but my heart would still race every time it happened. I turned over in my sleeping bag and glanced at Emma, who was sound asleep, breathing steadily. I envied her ability to drift off so easily. I reached for my phone to check the time. 2:47 a.m. I was still wide awake, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be outside. Then I heard it again, a noise, a tapping sound, right against the tent. It was faint at first, but then it became more distinct, like fingers lightly tapping the fabric. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was too deliberate to be the wind. Someone or something was out there. I held my breath, trying to listen over the howling wind. The tapping stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then there was a sound that made my blood run cold, a scraping like nails against wood. It came from the side of the tent where the entrance was. I had to fight the urge to scream. My heart pounded in my chest and my body was frozen with fear. I slowly turned to Emma, shaking her awake. Emma, wake up," I whispered, my voice trembling. She groggily opened her eyes and blinked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" "There's something outside," I whispered urgently. "I heard tapping and then this scraping sound. It's not the wind." Emma sat up, suddenly alert. "Are you sure? It could just be the trees. It's a forest, remember?" "I'm sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I heard." We both sat there in the dark, listening. The wind howled outside, but there was no more tapping or scraping. We stayed silent for a while, waiting, but the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The tension in the tent was unbearable. I could feel Emma's eyes on me, both of us listening for anything unusual. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and the snow outside had intensified, falling heavily and swirling in the wind. I shone the flashlight around the campsite, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of movement. I hesitated, then stepped outside the tent, my boots crunching in the snow. My heart raced as I stood there, alone in the freezing cold, holding the flashlight in front of me. The light bounced off the snow, casting long shadows. The wind howled through the trees, but the tapping and scraping had stopped. It was so eerily quiet now. "What are you doing?" Emma called from inside the tent, her voice shaky. "I just need to check," I said, my voice barely audible. I walked a few steps away from the tent, my breath visible in the air. The woods were silent again, the only sound the wind rattling the trees. I shined the flashlight around, but there was nothing unusual in sight. Just the trees, the snow, and the vast emptiness of the forest. Then, as I turned to go back to the tent, I saw something. Something I couldn't explain. In the distance, near the edge of the clearing, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure standing still in the snow. It was as if it had been waiting there, perfectly still, just watching. I froze, my heart in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me and I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't make a sound as it moved, just gliding silently through the snow. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the tent, stumbling in the snow, my legs shaking. I could hear Emma calling out to me, but I didn't stop until I was inside the tent, zipping it up behind me. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Emma sat up, her face pale. "What the hell happened? What did you see?" "I don't know," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. There was something out there, something watching me. It wasn't human. I don't know what it was, but it was moving toward me. Emma looked at me, her face full of concern. "Are you sure? Maybe you were just freaked out. You've been hearing things all night." "No, this was real," I insisted, shaking. "I swear it was out there, and I don't think we're alone." We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound, every movement made us jump. We kept the fire going, staring out into the night, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The figure never came back, and the wind settled down. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the sun was peeking through the clouds. The forest around us looked calm and peaceful, but we both knew it wasn't right. Something had been out there with us, something we couldn't explain. We packed up our camp in a hurry, not speaking much. We didn't want to talk about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was still watching us from the trees, waiting. We never spoke about the trip again, but neither of us ever camped in that area again, and I don't think either of us will ever forget the feeling of being watched in the cold, silent woods. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It had been a long winter and I was craving solitude. My friend Rob, always the enthusiast for the outdoors, convinced me that a winter camping trip would be the perfect escape from the monotony of the city. We decided on a remote location deep in the forest, untouched, pristine, and supposedly free of other hikers or campers. The place was known for its serenity, but there were whispers about its dark past, though nothing that could be confirmed. We arrived at the site after a grueling hike through the heavy snow, a couple of miles off the nearest trail. The temperature was well below freezing, but we were prepared. Rob was the type of person who loved the challenge and, though more cautious, was looking forward to the quiet and peace that the woods could offer. As we set up camp, the cold seeped into my bones, but the work kept me warm enough. Rob, ever the optimist, had already started setting up the fire pit, clearing snow away to expose the frozen ground. Night came quickly in the winter, and by 6 p.m., the sun had disappeared behind the thick canopy of trees, leaving the world in near total darkness. we had a small fire burning, its flames flickering and crackling against the heavy silence of the forest. It was so still that I could hear the occasional snap of tree branches in the distance, but that was about it. The wind had stopped completely, making it feel like we were the last two people on Earth. We ate our simple camping food, chatted about old memories, and laughed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything overt, just a constant feeling that the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. The fire flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw shadows shifting in the trees. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Rob seemed oblivious to the unease I was feeling, his voice rising in excitement as he spoke about the stars above us. But I couldn't stop glancing into the dark woods. There was a cold, suffocating presence lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight, as if the darkness had a life of its own. I finally spoke up. "Rob, do you feel that?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He turned to me, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" "It's just... everything's too still. Almost like the woods are holding their breath," I explained, my voice uncertain. Rob laughed and slapped me on the back. "You're just spooked, man. There's nothing out there. It's just the silence of winter. I love it." I nodded, trying to force a smile. But inside, I felt something stirring. It wasn't just the cold, it was the air itself, heavy with an unspoken presence. The fire crackled, sending a few sparks up into the dark sky, but it didn't feel like enough. I wanted to break the silence, to speak over it, to fill the empty spaces with noise. But there was something about the stillness that felt wrong. "Maybe we should go to bed soon," I said, trying to sound casual. Rob agreed, though he seemed more reluctant. We climbed into the tent, a two-person affair that was tight but warm. The sleeping bags enveloped us, and for a moment, I let the heat of the fire outside warm my thoughts. But just as I was about to drift off, there was a sound, a crack. It wasn't the familiar snap of a tree branch in the wind. This was different. It was sharp, almost like a footstep in the snow. My heart began to race. I sat up, straining to listen, but I couldn't hear anything else. Rob was already asleep, his steady breathing a soft rhythm in the quiet, but I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. I poked my head out of the tent, the cold air biting at my face. The fire had almost burned down to embers, and beyond the light, the forest was a mass of black shapes. The sound came again, this time closer. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was out there. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out a figure, but saw nothing. "Rob," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "There's someone out there." Rob stirred but didn't wake. I shook him gently. "Rob, wake up." He groggily opened his eyes. "What is it?" "Someone is out there. I heard footsteps." Rob sat up slowly, bluff, his expression unreadable. "It's probably a deer or something. You're overthinking it." But I wasn't convinced. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too purposeful. They weren't the random crunch of wildlife, they were human. I reached for the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to step outside. I scanned the dark woods, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the blackness, but I saw nothing. The silence was almost suffocating now, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it. Movement. Just at the edge of the trees. A figure. I froze, the light flickering in my hand. It was standing still, barely discernible in the dark, but I could make out the shape of a person, a man perhaps, dressed in a coat and boots. He wasn't moving, but he was there, just watching. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I stepped forward, my boots crunching in the snow, but the figure didn't move. I called again, louder this time. "Hey, are you lost?" Still no answer. The figure remained motionless, as though it had no intention of moving. At that moment, Rob emerged from the tent, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "What's going on? I don't see anyone." I pointed in the direction where I'd seen the figure. "He's standing right there. Can't you see him?" Rob looked over, his eyes narrowing, but there was nothing. The space where I'd seen the figure was empty. The trees were still and there was no movement. "Dude, you're freaking out," Rob said, a little annoyed. "There's no one there." I felt a chill run down my spine. I swear to God, there was someone. I saw him. But Rob was already turning back toward the tent. "Let's just go back inside. You're probably just seeing things. We're out in the woods, it's easy to get spooked." I wanted to argue, to demand that he look again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I followed him back into the tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside, the trees creaking, and the sound of my own breathing, which suddenly seemed too loud. I couldn't shake the image of the figure out of my mind, standing in the dark, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer. I sat up, my heart racing. Rob slept soundly beside me, completely unaware of what was happening outside. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was someone out there. I grabbed the flashlight again and opened the tent flap. The cold was unbearable now, and the darkness seemed to press in on me. I stepped out cautiously, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the snow. This time, I didn't look around for the figure. I just moved quickly toward the campfire, hoping the warmth would break the strange tension in the air. But when I reached the fire pit, I stopped cold. There in the snow was a set of footprints. Deep, clear prints, perfectly shaped in the snow. They circled the campfire, and then they led right up to the tent. They were fresh. I stumbled back, my pulse quickening. The footsteps were too clear, too deliberate. I turned to look at the tent, my breath coming in short gasps, but Rob was still asleep, completely unaware. And that's when I heard the whisper. It was soft, too soft to be a human voice, but unmistakable. It was coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. "Help me." The voice was weak, hollow, as though it had been carried on the wind. I looked back at the footprints, and for a moment, everything around me felt far too still. I ran back to the tent and woke Rob. We packed up in a hurry, barely speaking as we bundled our things and stumbled out of the forest. We didn't stop until we reached the car. We didn't speak much during the drive back, but we didn't have to. The woods had already said everything they needed to. When we finally made it home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something still whispers in the woods. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was early December when we decided to go winter camping in the mountains. My friend Mark and I had been planning the trip for months, and while the snowstorm warnings came in a little heavier than expected, we were determined to go ahead. Neither of us were rookies when it came to camping, and we'd both done our fair share of winter trips before. But this one was different. We were heading up to the Garnet Ridge Trail, a quiet spot about 10 miles north of town. The trail was known for its serene beauty during the winter, with snow-capped pine trees and a frozen river cutting through the valley below. Locals always said that the spot had a haunting feel in the winter, but that didn't bother either of us. We were both city guys, used to noise and crowds, so the idea of the woods in the dead of winter was more appealing than anything. The hike up was a bit tougher than we anticipated. The snow was deeper, and the wind was colder than expected. But the further we went, the more it felt like we were leaving the world behind. The last few miles of the trail were nearly untouched by human footprints. Mark was in good spirits, cracking jokes and making the hike feel lighter. But something nagged at me. The wind was sharp and biting, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional call of a raven high above. We set up camp in a small clearing about a half-mile off the trail. There were no other campers in sight, and the stillness was overwhelming. We pitched our tent quickly, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. Mark, ever the enthusiast, started talking about how great it was to be off the grid and how he'd always wanted to get away from everything for a while. I agreed, but in the back of my mind there was a lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where you couldn't even hear animals moving. As the fire flickered and the night deepened, I noticed a strange sensation. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know someone is watching you. But when I looked around, I saw nothing. The trees stood silent, their snow-covered branches swaying slightly in the wind. Mark kept talking, oblivious to the creeping unease that was slowly building inside me. Later that evening, around 10 p.m., we decided to get some sleep. The cold had set in, and we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire now just a distant memory outside. The wind howled outside, rattling the tent, but within the cocoon of our sleeping bags, it was warm enough to drift off. I had just started to doze when I heard it, a soft tapping. It came from somewhere outside the tent, a rhythmic sound like the tapping of fingernails against the fabric. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, straining my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but unmistakable. I reached over and shook Mark's shoulder. "Mark, wake up," I whispered urgently. He groaned and shifted. "What's up? There's something out there. Listen." He didn't seem to hear the noise, or at least he didn't seem bothered by it. "Dude, it's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping was still there, now faster and more insistent. My mind raced. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, some kind of rodent or bird, or even a tree branch tapping against the tent. But this felt different. The rhythm was deliberate, almost human. I climbed out of the sleeping bag and cautiously unzipped the tent, the cold air rushing in. The fire was now just embers, but the snow outside was illuminated by the pale light of the moon. The forest was silent. I looked around but saw nothing, no signs of movement, no shapes in the snow. "Mark," I said again, my voice a little more shaky this time. "I don't know, man. I swear there's something out there." Mark was still half asleep, groaning as he rolled over in his sleeping bag. I stepped outside the tent, my boots crunching in the snow, trying to listen for any sign of the noise. But there was nothing, just the deep silence of the snow-covered woods. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But the night was still, and nothing seemed out of place. I took a deep breath and returned to the tent, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Every little sound outside seemed to echo through the stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the firelight. Sometime after 3 a.m., I finally fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. The tapping was back, but this time it wasn't coming from the outside, it was coming from inside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring at the walls of the tent. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if something or someone was tapping on the walls of the tent from the inside. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Maybe the snow was shifting, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks. But the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate. It was the sound of a hand, not an element of nature. I turned to Mark, but he was still fast asleep. His slow, steady breathing was the only sound in the tent besides the tapping. I reached out and shook him harder this time. "Mark, wake up!" He stirred and groggily opened his eyes. "What the hell, man? What is it?" "There's something in the tent. It's tapping." Mark blinked, still disoriented, and looked at the walls of the tent. "You're crazy. It's just the wind or..." But then he stopped. He heard it too. The tapping. It was unmistakable now. Louder, almost frantic. Mark sat up, his face going pale. "What the hell is that?" We both sat there in silence, staring at the walls of the tent. The tapping was louder now, the sound reverberating through the fabric. We both grabbed our flashlights, shining them around, but there was nothing. No one was there. The snow outside was undisturbed, the clearing empty. Then, the tapping stopped. We didn't speak for a few moments, both of us too scared to say anything. But eventually Mark broke the silence. "We need to get out of here. Now." I didn't argue. I quickly grabbed my things, stuffing them into my pack as fast as I could. We left the tent in a hurry, both of us feeling the cold sting of the winter air against our skin as we hurried to pack up. As we moved, I felt the same unnerving sensation from earlier in the night, the feeling of being watched. But this time, it was different. There was something else out there. Something just beyond our vision. We didn't say a word as we packed up our camp and made our way back down the trail. The snow was falling harder now, but we didn't stop until we reached the safety of the parking lot, hours later. When we finally made it back home, we called the ranger station to report what had happened. The ranger who answered told us they'd had reports of strange occurrences on the Garnet Ridge Trail for years, though they had never been able to confirm anything. People spoke of hearing strange sounds in the night, tapping, whispers, footsteps, but no one had ever seen anything. The ranger didn't seem surprised by our story. In fact, he sounded as if he'd heard it all before. We never went back to Garnet Ridge. I haven't camped in the winter since. Some places, they say, are haunted by things that never left. Story the end.
Story number 8.
We had planned the winter camping trip for months. My cousin Ryan and I were both seasoned campers, having spent many weekends in the woods during warmer months. But this was our first winter trip, and we were excited about the challenge. It was going to be a weekend retreat to a remote, little-known campground near the National Forest, nestled deep in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The area was known for its beauty in the winter. Snow-dusted trees, frozen lakes, and long, quiet trails away from the distractions of civilization. We were hoping to escape the stresses of our daily lives and enjoy the peace and solitude of the forest. We arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon after a couple of hours' drive from home. The weather was cold, hovering just below freezing, but there was no snow yet. Still, the forecast called for snow to hit by nightfall, so we were eager to get our camp set up before the weather turned. Ryan and I had grown up exploring the woods together, and this trip was meant to be a bonding experience for both of us. The deep silence of the woods in winter was peaceful, but there was a strange weight to the air that I couldn't quite place. We gathered our gear, packed our sleds, and started trekking in. The trail was steep and winding, covered with patches of ice and snow. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was the kind of unease that settled deep in your chest, a creeping discomfort that made every sound in the forest seem magnified. Ryan, ever the optimist, joked about it. "Dude, you're being paranoid. It's just a forest." But even as he said it, I saw him glance around, his eyes scanning the trees. He knew something was off, too. We kept walking in silence, the only sounds the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional gust of wind that made the trees creak. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, softly at first, but quickly accumulating on the ground. It was beautiful, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were hiding something. We set up camp, each of us working quickly to erect the tent, gather firewood, and prepare our gear for the night. As darkness began to fall, we started a fire and huddled close to its warmth. The snow had picked up by then, falling heavily around us, muffling all sound except for the crackle of the fire. It felt as though the forest had gone quiet, as if it were holding its breath. "You think it's going to snow all night?" Ryan asked as we ate our freeze-dried meals. "Looks like it. The forecast said the storm would pick up in the evening, so I guess we're in for a long one," I replied, glancing at the darkening sky above. Ryan looked around the camp, his face partially illuminated by the firelight. "It's so quiet, isn't it? It feels like we're the only ones here," I nodded. "That's the whole point of this trip, right? Peace and solitude." But even as I said that, the silence felt unsettling. We had been out here for a few hours now, and not a single animal had crossed our path. No birds, no small creatures, no sounds of any kind. It was as though the woods themselves had frozen, still as statues. The snow was now falling heavily, a blanket of white covering everything in sight. The fire crackled, the only warmth in the cold expanse of snow. We stayed close to the fire, huddled in our sleeping bags and sleeping pads, talking softly, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that had settled over us. The temperature dropped quickly as the night wore on. I could feel the cold creeping into the corners of my sleeping bag, but I didn't want to move from the warmth of the fire. The storm was picking up, and the wind howled through the trees, making the tent shudder. We were both quiet, lost in our own thoughts when I heard it, a faint sound in the distance. It was hard to make out at first, but it sounded like a voice, a whispering carried by the wind. I stiffened, listening intently, but the sound faded almost immediately. "You hear that?" I whispered to Ryan. "Hear what?" "That whisper. I swear I heard someone talking out there." Ryan glanced around, his brow furrowed. "You're probably just hearing things. It's windy out there, and the snow makes everything sound weird." I wasn't so sure. The wind had picked up, but the whisper was different. It wasn't the usual rustling of branches or the howling wind. It was a soft voice, almost a murmur. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination, but I still couldn't get the thought out of my head. We fell silent again, trying to sleep, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as though the forest around us was waiting, watching. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it might be Ryan, maybe going outside to take a leak or check the fire, but then I remembered we had agreed to stay put for the night. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking carefully around the campsite. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, suffocating. "Ryan," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Ryan, wake up! Someone's outside." Ryan groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What, are you serious? It's probably just the wind." "No, this isn't the wind. Someone's walking around the tent." Ryan paused for a moment, listening. The footsteps stopped for a beat before starting again, coming closer to the tent. I could hear the crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. Ryan finally got up, pulling on his jacket. "I'll go check it out." "No, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Are you crazy? What if it's someone out there?" Ryan hesitated, but then nodded. "I'll go quietly. Just stay here." He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the snow. I watched him through the small opening, trying to see anything in the thick darkness outside, but it was impossible. The snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility to just a few feet. "Ryan, come back," I whispered urgently. But the only response was the sound of his footsteps, crunching in the snow, moving away from the tent. I was left alone, heart pounding, every muscle tensed. I didn't know if I should follow him, stay in the tent, or scream for help. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only the sound of the wind and the snow. But then I heard something else. Soft, dragging footsteps, as if something was being pulled through the snow, coming closer and closer to the tent. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing. I didn't want to be alone in the dark, but I had no choice. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the snow, scanning the campsite for any sign of Ryan. "Ryan?" I called out, but my voice came out more like a whisper. The air was thick with silence, the only sound, the wind and the snow. Then, through the falling snow, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the trees. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Ryan, what the hell are you doing?" I asked, running toward him. But he didn't respond. As I reached him, I saw what had frozen him in place, a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the edge of the woods and into the darkness beyond. But there were no footsteps returning. Ryan turned to me, his face ashen. "We need to go. Now." I didn't ask questions. We didn't pack up, didn't hesitate. We ran, slipping and falling in the snow, not stopping until we reached the car at the trailhead. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was as if something was following us, just out of sight. We never spoke about what happened that night. We didn't need to. There was something in those woods, something that neither of us could explain. We never went back. Story, the end.